Some wars never end. Not in history books. Not in parades. Not even in graves. This is the story of one man who was never supposed to survive. One soldier among thousands, forgotten by the world, but remembered by the cold. He did not surrender. He endured, and every breath he took in that frozen valley carried the weight of every man who never came home. Subscribe, because some legacies are buried under snow and silence. They dropped into North Korea on a cold that did not belong to this earth. The mountains were sharp and dry. The snow was not soft. It was shards. It was bone. The man we follow now was named Carter Mace, Corporal, United States Marine Corps, 26 years old, quiet, always the last one off the truck, but always the first when it counted. He had never seen snow before Chosin, and what he saw there was not weather. It was punishment. Their unit was pinned northeast of the reservoir. Orders were confused. Radios froze. Breath turned into fog before it could even leave the mouth. Chinese troops surrounded them from the hills. Waves of them, endless, armed with rifles, older than Carter's father. But they never stopped coming. It was day 3. Rations gone. Half the squad dead. The sky above looked down but never spoke. Carter carried the dog tags of 2 men around his neck. One was his friend. One he had just met. Their names were ice now, frozen to the steel. His gloves were torn. He could no longer feel the trigger, but he kept his rifle clean, always. Even if his fingers cracked and bled while doing it. He remembered what the lieutenant told him. "We're not dying here. We're fighting our way out." But the lieutenant was dead now. Shot through the neck at midnight. Died quietly. No one screamed. There was no screaming left in them. Carter took his spot. Not by choice, but because no one else moved. That night he sat in a trench made of ice in silence. He watched with eyes that no longer blinked from cold. The stars above were so sharp they felt like needles. He prayed once, only once, and it was not for salvation. It was for meaning, because when your hands are frozen to your weapon and the men beside you stop breathing while still sitting upright, you stop praying for rescue. You pray that it mattered, that someone, somewhere, would remember this place, remember these faces, remember that they did not fall. They froze, standing, eyes forward, rifles ready, souls burning like coals against the cold. Carter woke up with snow covering his chest like a burial sheet, and for a moment, he thought he had died, but then the pain in his legs returned and he knew he was still here. Still breathing, still trapped in the place where time moved slower than death and faster than hope. The foxhole beside him was empty. The man who had been posted there, gone. Without a sound, without a trail, just gone, like the mountain had taken him quietly. Carter stood up slowly, his joints stiff, his back sore, his thoughts quieter than ever. He checked his rifle, wiped it again, checked his pocket for the piece of chocolate he had saved for 3 days. It was still there, frozen solid, still his one small anchor, 2, before he took a single bite, let it melt without chewing. It reminded him of being human. The snow around him was calm but not peaceful. It was the calm that came before something bad, not after, and he knew it. His breath was sharp. His lips cracked. The sky was a dull steel gray. No sun, no direction. He moved. Up the hill, slow, quiet, every step sinking a little deeper than it should have. The silence around him was not normal. It was staged. It felt like a trap, but he kept walking. He reached the tree line, looked down at the valley. The outpost, the cratered road, the burnt supply trucks. The men, the frozen ones, their bodies twisted but eyes wide, as if even death had not been enough to turn them away. Carter clenched his teeth, turned back toward the path the sergeant had marked 2 nights before only. Now the markers were gone. No sticks, no cloth, no sign anyone had come this way. He crouched, listened. Nothing but the whisper of the snow. That was not real wind, not real movement. It was memory, trying to sound like weather, and deep down, he knew that This mountain was not just killing men, it was keeping pieces of them, locking them in the ice, like forgotten pages of a story. No one was writing anymore, and Carter was afraid not of dying, but of being erased, being left behind in a place that did not exist on maps or medals or graves, just cold, endless, and blank. Carter stopped at the edge of the ridge. His boots sank an inch deeper with every breath he took. The cold was alive now. It crept up from the ground, not just through his legs, but into his thoughts, into the memories he was trying not to think about. There were tracks in the snow, not boot prints, just long, uneven drags, like someone had crawled, like someone had tried to pull themselves out but never made it. He followed them, slowly, rifle raised, his breath sharp like glass. The sky had turned darker. The clouds were bruised and low, pressing on his helmet. The air tasted like rust, like old blood that never dried. He moved behind a fallen tree, then stopped. A body lay there, face down, covered in a layer of snow, too thin to hide it, but just enough to blur the details. Carter stepped closer, his hands shaking now, not from cold, from fear, from knowing. He rolled the body over. It was Sergeant Klein. His mouth was open, his eyes frozen mid-blink. His hand clutched a flare gun, but it had misfired. Frost had eaten the mechanism. Carter kneeled, took the tags, closed the eyes, then stood again. There was no time for ceremony, just silence, just motion, just survival. He moved again, downhill this time, following nothing but instinct. He heard something then, a faint cry, weak, like a child trying not to be heard. He turned, raised his rifle, waited. Another sound, a whisper, a breath. He moved toward it, step by step, and there he saw it. A foxhole, half buried, and inside was Jensen, barely alive, lips blue, one eye swollen shut, his arm tied with a bloody rag. Carter dropped beside him, checked his pulse, still there, faint, but fighting. Jensen looked up, tried to speak, failed. Carter gave him the last piece of chocolate, pressed it into his mouth, then leaned close, told him they were not dying here, not now, not like this. And in that moment, Carter made a choice. He would carry him out, no matter the cost, no matter the weight. He would not leave another man behind, even if it meant dying standing. Carter pulled Jensen onto his back. The man's weight felt heavier than it should have, like the mountain itself had added something more to him, a burden not measured in pounds but in silence, in frost, in grief. The snow had thickened. The sky above was now a lid, closed, dull gray. No light, no direction, just pressure. He adjusted the straps, tightened his gloves, and began walking. Each step sank deeper than the last. His boots now soaked, his calves numb, but he did not stop. The foxhole disappeared behind them, swallowed by the wind that now screamed, not howled, screamed, like metal tearing through bone. Carter leaned forward into it. His face burned, his lips cracked further, but he kept going. Jensen moaned once, a sound that barely reached Carter's ear. He whispered back, told him to hold on, told him to remember. Home told him the ridge was close, but Carter knew it was not. Not yet, maybe not ever. The snow now came sideways, driven like nails. It stung his eyes, froze his lashes, turned the world into a sheet of moving white. He stopped behind a rock, shielded them both, took a breath, then checked Jensen's pulse again. Still there, but fading. He ripped open his own coat, pressed Jensen close, skin to skin through layers of soaked fabric. Anything to transfer heat, anything to fight the cold that wanted to take them both. The flare gun from Klein was still in his belt, useless, jammed, but he kept it anyway. Not as a tool, as a reminder. He had seen 20 men die already, some fast, some slow, none easy, and if he had to walk this whole mountain alone, carrying one man out of hell, then that would be enough. That would be his war, not for medals, not for headlines, but for one man, one breath, one more mile. The snow was falling thicker now. It felt like the sky was trying to bury them alive. One layer at a time. Carter kept moving, legs numb, shoulders locked. The wind pressed against his chest like a wall. Every breath was sharp. His lungs hurt, but he would not stop. Not yet. Not until he could no longer move. He kept whispering Jensen's name, kept reminding him he was not alone, kept speaking just to prove he was still alive. Somewhere behind him the mountain groaned, not a sound, from the earth. A sound from memory, from the weight of all that had happened, of all who had fallen. He saw faces again, faces frozen in the white, men he had known, men he had lost, each one staring as if asking why he was still walking, why he had not joined them. He shook the thought, focused forward, focused on breath, on steps, on survival. The ridge was near, he remembered it. A cluster of dead trees and a rock shaped like a boot. That was the marker. If he could find that, he could find the path. He could make it out. But the world was white now, nothing but white. The trees blurred, shapes melted into each other. He called again. No answer. Not from Jensen, not from anyone. Just wind, just snow, just silence. He stumbled, fell to one knee, the weight on his back heavier than ever. He growled, pushed up, legs shaking, stood again. He would not die kneeling. Not here, not now. The ridge came into view, barely a shadow in the mist. He aimed for it, moved toward it. Every step felt like a memory being erased. And then he saw something, a flicker, a shadow, a figure standing still. Just ahead. Carter froze, raised his rifle. The shape did not move, did not speak, did not breathe. He stepped closer, eyes narrowed. The figure was in uniform, helmet low, rifle in hand. But it was not real. It was ice, a statue, a frozen man, one of theirs, preserved in death, still standing, still facing the ridge, as if still guarding. Carter stepped past him, whispered, "A thank you," then moved forward, toward the trees, toward the rock, toward the one last hope that someone might still be listening, somewhere. Carter reached the ridge as the last light disappeared behind the clouds, and the sky dimmed into a colorless void, where time had no meaning, and nothing could be trusted not. Even his own footsteps. He stopped behind the rock, shaped like a boot, leaned against it for a moment, and let the weight of Jensen press deeper into his shoulders. The man was still breathing, but just barely. His head, now slumped against Carter's back, like a sleeping child, too tired to dream. Carter looked ahead. The trail was gone, buried under a fresh layer of snow. Untouched, unmarked, silent. He moved forward slowly, dragging his boots through the powder, hoping to find some sign, some clue, some direction. But the mountain gave nothing, only the wind answered. And the wind said nothing useful, nothing hopeful, just old sounds stretched thin over miles of dead air. Then he heard it, not a voice, not a scream, just a snap, a sound too real, too close to ignore. He froze, dropped to one knee, raised his rifle, and waited, breathing low, listening. The sound came again, a branch under pressure, a step against ice. Someone was near, not a ghost, not a memory, something alive. He whispered Jensen's name, but got no reply. Then a shape emerged from the dark, a man crawling through the snow, uniform torn, blood trailing behind him. He looked up, saw Carter, and smiled with broken teeth. It was Reyes from Echo. Squad gone missing 2 nights before, assumed dead, frozen, or captured, but now here, crawling back from nowhere. Carter rushed to him, dropped Jensen gently, and dragged Reyes behind the rock. His eyes were wide, filled with something more than pain. They were filled with stories that had no words. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. Carter held him, whispered calm into his ear, tried to patch the wound on his side, but it was deep, too deep. Reyes gripped Carter's arm, pulled him close, and mouthed the word. Ambush. Carter's heart locked cold deeper than the mountain. He looked ahead toward the trail and saw it then. Shapes moving in the mist, low to the ground, quiet and organized. Not random, not lost Chinese soldiers, maybe a dozen, maybe more. Not shooting, not shouting, just surrounding Carter. Pressed down over Reyes' chest, held the rifle tight, checked. Jensen's pulse again, still there. Barely. Now he had three choices: fight, hide, or run, but none of them promised survival, only different kinds of death. And he realized something, that this ridge was never meant to be crossed. It was meant to trap, to bleed, to bury, and the only way forward now was through the kind of courage that men do not write songs about, only silence. Carter pressed his back against the rock and listened. As the snow swallowed the sound of boots crunching through ice, he could count them. Now not by sight but by rhythm. There were 9, maybe 10 figures closing in from multiple sides, and every second of silence made the air around him feel sharper, like blades drawn. Just above the skin, he gripped his rifle tighter, his hands stiff but steady, his breath short and sharp. He looked down at Reyes, whose lips had turned gray, and who no longer blinked. Carter reached for the flare gun he had kept since Sergeant Klein fell, and knew it still would not fire, but he held it anyway, as if holding it made him more than just one man lost in the snow. He leaned toward Jensen, whose breathing had grown so quiet it felt like a dream, and whispered into his ear, told him not to move, told him to stay small and stay silent, because this ridge was not theirs anymore, and the mountain had already taken too many. Then he stood slow, like a man unafraid, like a man who had nothing left to lose. He moved away from the rock into the open, not running, not hiding, just walking forward, into the white, and into the waiting eyes of the soldiers that now stepped into view. Their rifles raised, their mouths hidden under scarves, their coats layered and worn by war. Carter did not speak. He raised his arms slowly and held the flare gun high, not as a threat, but as a sign of surrender, or strength, or maybe both. The soldiers stopped, stared, unsure of what. They were seeing one man standing alone in the storm, holding a broken flare gun and carrying the weight of 2 others. Carter took another step, and then another, his legs trembling but unshaken. He spoke then, loud enough to cut through the wind. He said, "I am not your enemy, I am not afraid, and I will not let these men die alone." The soldiers looked at one another. One lowered his rifle, then another. None of them spoke. Carter dropped to one knee, placed the flare gun in the snow, and pointed back toward the rock where Jensen and Reyes waited. He said, "Take them, help them, or shoot me now. But either way, I am done hiding." The silence that followed was not cold, it was sacred. It was the kind of silence that made men remember who they were before the war. And then one soldier stepped forward, dropped his own weapon, and walked past Carter toward the rock. And in that moment something changed. Not the war, not the cold, but something older, something deeper, like the mountain itself had taken a breath and decided just this once to let 3 men live. The soldier who approached the rock knelt beside Jensen and looked at him without hate, without fear, without orders. Just a long, slow look, like one man seeing another through the fog of something older than war. He touched Jensen's throat, then looked back at Carter and gave a single nod. Not of loyalty, not of obedience, but of agreement, as if saying, "Yes, I see what you carry, and I will help you carry it." The other soldiers slowly lowered their rifles. Not all at once, not with trust, but with a kind of exhausted mercy. Carter did not move, he did not speak. He only watched, as the first soldier motioned to the others, and together they formed a circle. Not tight, not defensive, but human. The wind still howled, but now it sounded farther away, like it had been pushed back by the weight of that moment. Carter walked back to the rock, dropped to one knee, lifted Reyes again. He was cold, but still breathing, barely. 2 of the enemy soldiers stepped forward. One lifted Jensen, the other took Reyes. Carter hesitated, then let go, because trust was the only weapon he had left, and he was willing to risk it. They moved as one. Not an army, not enemies, just men, moving through snow that had buried too many names. The ridge behind them disappeared. The world ahead was still dangerous, still unknown, but different. For the first time in days, Carter felt something that had almost died in him. Not warmth, not safety, but the smallest flicker of belief that maybe survival was not the end, that maybe this story would not be forgotten, that maybe someone would remember what happened on this mountain and the men who chose not to shoot. They moved slowly through the frozen trees. Carter walked with his rifle strapped across his back, not as a weapon now, but as memory, as burden. The soldiers around him said nothing. Their breath fogged the air. Their boots crunched over ice and broken branches. Each step was careful. Each sound was heavy. The man carrying Jensen slipped once. Carter reached out, steadied him. The soldier nodded. No words, no thanks. Just eyes that had seen enough to understand everything without speaking. Reyes groaned, his voice raw. Carter stepped beside him, whispered that he was safe, that they were going home, but he did not know if it was true. He did not know where home was anymore. Not really. Home was not a place. It was a feeling, a silence without fear, a night without blood, and that had not existed since the first bullet, since the first friend died. The mountain rose beside them, still cold, still cruel, but for now it watched in silence, letting them pass. The lead soldier raised his hand. The group stopped. Ahead, there was smoke, faint, rising behind a broken wall of stone. Carter stepped forward, looked through his scope. It was a camp, small, makeshift, half-burned, probably abandoned, but maybe not. The soldier beside him pointed, then held up 2 fingers. Carter nodded. 2 men, maybe guards, maybe survivors, maybe something worse. It did not matter. They had wounded. They needed heat, shelter, time. Carter led the way, rifle low, eyes sharp. When they reached the camp, no shots were fired, just 2 figures sitting by a dying fire, too tired to fight, too broken to care. One of them waved, then collapsed. Carter moved fast. The others followed. They built a wall from rubble, lit the fire again, wrapped Reyes and Jensen in every cloth they had, gave them water, melted snow, pressed to their lips with hands that shook not from fear, but from remembering how many times they had done this before. For others who never woke up, that night, no one slept. They took turns watching the tree line, listening for boots, for voices, for death. But the night passed, quiet, long, cold, but alive. Morning came without sunlight. The sky was pale. The fire was dying, but everyone was still breathing. Carter checked Jensen first. His skin was warmer. His chest moved steady. Then he moved to Reyes. The blood on his side had dried black, but his eyes opened. Slow, heavy. Carter leaned in, asked him if he remembered where he was. Reyes nodded once, then whispered something. Not a cry, not a prayer, just 2 words. The letter. Carter frowned, reached into Reyes' coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, soaked at the edges, but still whole. He unfolded it. The words were shaky, written in pencil. The top read, "To my son." Carter froze. He read it all, every line. It was not just a farewell, it was a map, coordinates, a last known outpost, a group of missing soldiers, men thought lost, but maybe alive, maybe waiting. The letter ended with a promise. "I will come back, even if I have to crawl." Carter folded it again, held it like a flame, showed it to the others. They gathered around, looked at the paper, then at each other. No one spoke, but they all knew. Rest was over. This story was not finished. The outpost was close. If they moved now, they might make it. They might find the others, They might save someone, like someone had tried to save them. Carter stood, looked to the trees, looked beyond the cold. He strapped the rifle across his back, helped lift Reyes, nodded at the others, and without a word, they left. The fire left the camp, walked back into the mountain, toward a place forgotten by command, forgotten by history, but not forgotten by them. The snow was lighter now, but the cold was deeper. The silence stretched so far that Carter could hear every heartbeat in his chest, every crack beneath his boots, every breath from the men behind him. The letter from Reyes was pressed against his chest, tucked inside his jacket like a compass, not one that pointed north, but one that pointed toward something heavier than survival, something older than war, a promise made by one man to another, and now carried by a stranger who had no reason left to hope, but moved forward anyway. The others followed in single file, their weapons ready but not raised, their eyes scanning every tree, every rock, every flicker of shadow between the branches. Carter stopped at a ridge, looked down. There it was, the outpost, half buried, half broken, but real. Smoke rose faintly. From one corner, a sign of life, or something trying to be life. He raised a hand. The group dropped low, moved quiet, moved fast. They reached the outer fence, found a break in the wire, slipped through without a word. Inside, the air smelled like firewood and blood. They stepped over broken crates, empty shells, frozen packs. Then a sound came. A voice, weak, American. Carter turned, found a man slumped against the wall, beard thick, face sunken, but alive. Behind him, more bodies, some breathing, some not. Carter dropped to his knees, pulled the man close, said, "We're here. You're not alone." The man cried, couldn't stop, just shook and cried. The others moved fast, built heat, cleared space, shared food, shared silence, and in the middle of it all, Carter stood still, holding the letter, looking at the men who had almost become ghosts, and knowing the promise was kept, even if the cost was never spoken. The outpost was silent by nightfall, but it was not dead. It breathed in the shallow rasps of wounded men. It moved in the flicker of firelight on broken walls. It remembered through the stains in the snow and the worn patches on the floor. Carter sat beside the fire, holding the letter again, running his fingers over the words, as if touching them could help him understand why any of them were still alive. Jensen lay beside him, his chest rising slowly, his lips no longer blue, his eyes sometimes opening, just long enough to recognize a face, before closing again. Reyes rested with his back against the stone, his pulse still weak, but steady. The others took shifts watching the perimeter, speaking only when necessary. Every sound from the woods made their fingers tighten around the triggers, but nothing came. Just wind, just snow, just time pressing down on all of them. Carter stood and walked to the edge of the outpost, stared into the dark, and tried to remember who he was before the mountain, before the cold, before the silence. But he could not, because the war had erased it, piece by piece, until all that remained was this, a man standing where others had fallen, carrying names that would never be carved into stone, only remembered by those who survived. And Carter knew now that survival was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the wait. The sky turned white again, not with snow, but with fog, thick, blinding, heavy like memory. Carter stood with his rifle across his chest. The others moved behind him, quiet, tired, focused. The letter was still tucked against his heart, as if it would guide him one more time. They were not running. They were not hiding. They were leaving, slowly, together, with the wounded between them, and nothing ahead but white. The mountain had let them rest, but now it whispered again, the kind of whisper that sounded like warning. like grief waiting on the other side of silence. Carter stepped forward, felt the earth shift under his boot. He stopped, raised a hand. The men behind him froze. He knelt, brushed the snow away. A wire, thin, hidden, deadly. A trap, left behind by someone who expected no one would ever leave this place alive. He followed it with his eyes, found the metal buried under ice. A mine, one wrong step, one mistake, and all of them gone. He called for Harris, the youngest in the group, a farm kid from Texas who had learned to disarm traps with hands too careful for war. Harris came forward, eyes wide, knees shaking, but steady. He worked without words. Carter watched every move, every breath, and then a click, a pause, a silence that froze the wind. Then Harris looked up, nodded. It was done. They passed through, one by one, each man stepping only where the last had stepped, trusting the prints more than their eyes. Carter was last. He looked back once, at the outpost, at the place that almost became their grave. Then forward, toward the path that would take them off the mountain, and into the world that had already forgotten they were. Up here, he did not speak, but he promised he would not let it stay forgotten. They came down the mountain slow, each step a memory, each breath a name. The trees thinned, the snow grew softer, the silence less cruel. Carter led with his head down, eyes locked on the path. Behind him, Reyes leaned on two men. Jensen was carried on a stretcher built from branches and torn jackets. No one spoke unless they had to. The cold still clung to their bones, but something had changed. The fear was quieter now, the kind that lives deep and whispers only when you're alone. They crossed a frozen river, past the remains of a burned supply truck, rusted steel, bullet holes, a jacket still hanging from the mirror, like someone had hoped they would return. Harris stopped, picked it up, folded it, and tucked it into his pack, not for warmth, for memory. They walked past it all, through snow, through fog, until they saw a road, faint, narrow, but real. On the edge of it, a sign, bent, faded, but still standing. Carter wiped the frost from its face. Read the words out, loud. Welcome to the world. That was enough. They kept walking, toward sound, toward color, toward something like peace, but not peace, not yet. Because peace is not what comes after war. Peace is what you build, one story at a time, one name at a time. Carter knew that, and he knew he would carry this story, all of it, the weight, the pain, the silence, the blood, and he would tell it somehow, somewhere, because the mountain might forget, the snow might bury, but the world needed to know what it cost to survive. They reached the edge of the forest, just as the sun broke through the clouds, weak, pale, but they're the first light they had seen in weeks. Carter stopped and turned around, looked back at the mountain, at the white that swallowed names, at the silence that had taken voices. He said nothing, just breathed and remembered. A truck arrived that evening, tires cracking through ice. Soldiers in clean uniforms stepped out, eyes wide, faces stunned. No one expected them. No one knew, until Carter handed them the letter. Folded, stained, but still clear. They read it, passed it hand to hand, then looked at the men who had carried it this far. Medics moved in, took Jensen, took Reyes, wrapped blankets around the rest, gave them coffee, gave them warmth, gave them something that almost felt like human again. One of the officers asked Carter for names. He gave them, slowly, clearly, every man, every loss, every step. Then the officer asked what happened up there. Carter looked at him, looked past him, and said, "Write it down, all of it, not just the dying, but the surviving, not just the fear, but the choice to keep walking." The officer nodded, then wrote, and Carter sat down on the back of the truck, hands shaking, eyes dry. Not because the tears were gone, but because even grief needs rest. As the truck drove away, Carter looked once more at the mountain and whispered to himself, "You didn't take us." We walked out, and we brought their names with us. He closed his eyes. Let the wind pass over him. Let the noise return. Let the world return. And for the first time in too long, he believed someone would remember. They were never meant to be remembered, but we did. Their pain, their silence, their fight to survive when hope was buried under snow. This was more than a battle. It was a story of brotherhood, of scars, of promises kept in the darkest hours. If this story moved you even a little, subscribe, because this is just one of many voices lost in history, and we're here to make sure they're never forgotten.